By the time Wyatt Carver was done, the silence in that room was worth more than the brand new tractor gleaming under the promotional lights. It was a dense, heavy silence, the kind that follows a revelation so profound it rearranges the world in the minds of all who witness it. It was the sound of 24 seasoned farmers simultaneously realizing they had been played for fools for years. But when Wyatt first walked in, that silence was still a long way off. When he first pushed through the double-glass doors of the Agri-Future dealership, covered in the honest grime of a day's work and clutching a dented Hills Brothers coffee tin, the only thing he earned was laughter. It was not loud, boisterous laughter, but something far more insulting. A low, rumbling wave of condescending chuckles and knowing smirks that passed between the men in clean jeans and crisp, branded polo shirts. They saw a boy, not a man. They saw dirt, not dignity. They saw a relic from a dying past wandering into their gleaming, sterile future. They had no way of knowing that the past was precisely what he had come to weaponize. They had no idea that inside that coffee tin, beneath a few folded bills, was a truth more powerful than all the horsepower in that showroom combined. And in his mind, clearer than any blueprint, was the memory of the man who had taught him that the most expensive problems often have the simplest and most overlooked solutions. The event was billed as a Farmer Appreciation Day, a masterpiece of corporate marketing orchestrated by Sterling Black, the dealership's ambitious manager. It was an invitation-only affair, a calculated gesture of goodwill aimed at the region's most successful agricultural producers. Free barbecue sizzled on industrial-sized grills outside, the smoke mingling with the intoxicating scent of new rubber and fresh paint. Inside the cavernous showroom, fluorescent lights buzzed over a fleet of monstrous green and yellow machines, their polished surfaces reflecting the faces of the men who circled them with a mixture of awe and aspiration. These were the titans of modern farming, machines that cost more than the houses many of these men had grown up in, bristling with satellite dishes, touch screens, and an incomprehensible web of hydraulic lines. Sterling Black moved through the crowd like a shepherd tending his flock, a practiced smile on his face, his handshakes firm and his eye contact unwavering. He wore boots that had cost a fortune but had clearly never seen a muddy field, and his voice was a smooth baritone that spoke of financing options and service contracts as if they were articles of faith. Wyatt Carver did not belong here. At 24, he looked younger, with a lanky frame that his worn-out overalls seemed to hang from rather than fit. His hair was a shaggy, sun-bleached brown, and his face was all sharp angles and quiet observation. His hands, resting at his sides, were the hands of a man twice his age, the knuckles scarred and the fingernails permanently outlined in black grease that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. He had driven his grandfather's old Ford F-15, a truck so rusted and dented it looked like it had been salvaged from a riverbed. He'd parked it at the far end of the lot, nestled between a gleaming new dually and a luxury sedan, where it sat like a humble brown sparrow in a flock of peacocks. He hadn't come for the free food or the spectacle. He had come because a man he respected, a farmer named Abe Henderson, was in trouble, and that trouble had started right here in this temple of modern agriculture. Wyatt's presence was a quiet intrusion, a speck of dust in a sterile environment, and the men in the room registered it as such. They saw the faded flannel shirt under his overalls, the scuffed work boots, the coffee tin he held as if it were a collection plate. A few of the older farmers, men who had known his grandfather, gave him a hesitant, almost pitying nod. The younger salesmen, Sterling's acolytes, just smirked. They saw a ghost, a remnant of the small-time do-it-yourself world their dealership was systematically rendering obsolete. The centerpiece of the showroom, however, was not one of the new, gleaming machines. Positioned on a low-carpeted dais under a dedicated spotlight was an old tractor, a John Deere 4020 from the late 1960s. It was not there to be admired. It was there to be mocked. Its green paint was faded and peeling, revealing patches of rust like raw wounds. One of its massive rear tires was flat, causing it to list to the side like a tired old animal. A hand-painted sign hung from the front grille, reading, "Time for an upgrade." It was a prop, a theatrical device in Sterling Black's sermon on progress. It was a trade-in, and Sterling made sure everyone knew its story. He would pat its fender, a gesture that was more of a slap, and tell the crowd how it had suffered a catastrophic transmission failure, a common ailment for a machine of its age. The repair cost, he would announce with a dramatic sigh, was more than the old beast was worth. It was a lesson, he said, in knowing when to let go of the past. It was a symbol of failure. For the other farmers, the 4020 was a piece of nostalgia, a reminder of their father's farms, a machine they had learned to drive on. They looked at it with a kind of fond melancholy. But for Wyatt Carver, it was something else entirely. He saw not just a machine, but a specific system, a language he understood intimately. He knew the synchro-range transmission in that tractor better than he knew the faces of some of his own relatives. He had taken them apart and put them back together in his grandfather's dusty workshop, his small hands following the guidance of larger, more patient ones. He looked at the sad listing machine and felt a pang of indignation. It was like seeing a respected elder being publicly ridiculed by an arrogant youth. He edged closer, his eyes scanning the machine not for its flaws, but for its story. He ignored the rust and the flat tire. He looked at the control levers, the clutch pedal, the faint pattern of wear on the gearshift knob. He saw a history of hard work, not of failure. And when Sterling Black finally mounted the small stage for his keynote address, he chose that old tractor as his backdrop, placing a proprietary hand on its faded hood. Sterling cleared his throat, and a hush fell over the room. He was a performer, and this was his stage. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice amplified by a wireless microphone. "Welcome to AgriFuture. We're here today not just to show you the latest and greatest in farming technology, but to celebrate you, the men who feed our nation." He paused for effect, letting the flattery settle. Then he gestured to the old 4020 behind him. "We see a lot of old iron come through these doors, machines that have served their time, machines that have built legacies, and we respect that. But we also have to be realists. The world moves on, technology gets better, faster, more efficient." He looked out into the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces until they landed, with deliberate precision, on Wyatt Carver. "Some things," Sterling said, his voice dropping into a tone of mock solemnity, "are just meant for the scrapyard." A few of his salesmen snickered. "You can't put a price on progress, folks, but you can definitely put one on failure. This old girl," he patted the tractor again, "is a lesson in knowing when to quit." The insult, though ostensibly aimed at the inanimate object, was so clearly directed at Wyatt that a wave of uncomfortable shuffling passed through the crowd. Wyatt didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on the old tractor, his expression unreadable. He was no longer just an observer. He was now part of the performance, cast in the role of the fool. And in that moment of public humiliation, a quiet, cold resolve settled in his gut. He knew something Sterling Black did not. He knew that the most dangerous man in any room is the one who is underestimated. He also knew, with a certainty that was almost preternatural, that the story of this day would not end with laughter. That certainty was not arrogance, it was an inheritance. It had been forged in a place that was the polar opposite of this sterile showroom, a drafty, sprawling workshop that smelled of packed earth, cold steel, and 30 years of spilled oil. It was his grandfather's sanctuary, a place where the gospel was written in grease and the hymns were the rhythmic clatter of a well-tuned diesel engine. Old Man Carver, as everyone in the county had called him, had been more than a farmer. He was a diagnostician, a surgeon of steel. To him, a machine was not just a tool, it was a living system with its own logic, its own pains, its own truths. He was a man of few words, but infinite patience, a man who could tell you the health of an engine by the color of its smoke or the precise location of a hydraulic leak by the pitch of its whine. He was a legend in a world that was slowly forgetting the value of such men. Wyatt had been his shadow from the time he was old enough to walk. While other boys were playing with plastic toys, Wyatt was handing his grandfather wrenches, his small fingers fumbling with the heavy, cold steel. His first lessons were not in words, but in observation. He learned to watch, to listen, to feel. His grandfather would have him place his hand on a running engine block. "Feel that, boy?" he'd rumble. That's its heartbeat. Learn the rhythm of a healthy heart, and you'll always know when it's sick. He taught Wyatt to read the land, to understand the relationship between the soil and the strain it put on a plow. But his most profound lessons were about failure. "Everything breaks, Wyatt," he'd said one afternoon, his hands deep in the greasy guts of a combine's transmission. "That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is why. Never trust the easy answer. The problem isn't where the noise is, it's where the silence is supposed to be. Go all the way to the bottom of the problem. Find the first thing that went wrong, the smallest thing. The truth is always there, at the beginning." This philosophy was not just an abstract concept, it was a methodology, and it was codified in a collection of 3-ring binders that lined a long, sturdy shelf above the main workbench. There were 24 of them, each one with a neatly labeled spine. John Deere 40 Series, International Harvester 1466, Case Agri-King, Ford 8N. These were not just collections of owner's manuals, they were his grandfather's life's work, his mechanical Bible. Inside each one, tucked between the official printed pages, were his own handwritten notes on worn, yellowed legal paper. There were drawings of gear assemblies, notes on torque specifications he'd found through trial and error, and warnings about common failure points the manufacturers never admitted to. But the most valuable things in those binders were the papers that looked the most official. Technical Service Bulletins, or TSBs. These were communications sent from the manufacturer to its dealerships, quietly acknowledging design flaws or providing revised repair procedures. They were not for public consumption. They were secrets, admissions of imperfection that the marketing departments would rather forget. His grandfather had a network of friends, mechanics at dealerships all over the state, and for 30 years they had traded these bulletins like contraband, building a library of hidden knowledge. The binder for the John Deere 4020 was the thickest of all. It was his grandfather's favorite tractor, the one he considered the pinnacle of its era. And within that binder, nestled in a yellowed plastic sleeve, was a single-page TSB from 1958. It was for the early synchro-range transmission. The bulletin was dense with technical jargon, but its message was simple. It described a rare but catastrophic-seeming failure mode where the transmission would lock up completely, often after being shifted into reverse. The operator would hear a loud clank and then nothing. The tractor would be immovable, as if the entire gearbox had seized into a single, solid block of steel. The official dealership repair procedure at the time was a complete transmission rebuild, a costly and time-consuming job. But this bulletin, issued quietly to a select few master mechanics, revealed the true culprit. It wasn't a shattered gear or a failed clutch pack. It was a tiny bronze bushing on the reverse idler shaft, a part no bigger than a man's thumb. Under specific load conditions, this bushing could wear prematurely and fail, allowing the shaft to shift just enough to lock the entire gear train. The bulletin provided a new part number for an improved hardened steel bushing and a simplified procedure for replacing it that could be done in a few hours, without even removing the transmission from the tractor. The part itself cost even then only a few dollars. Wyatt remembered the day his grandfather showed it to him. He had been about 14, full of the arrogance that comes with a little bit of knowledge. He had just successfully diagnosed a faulty alternator on his own. His grandfather had just smiled, pulled the binder from the shelf, and opened it to that page. "You're getting good, boy," he'd said, "but never forget this. The difference between a $10,000 repair and a $10 repair is sometimes just one piece of paper. The difference between a good mechanic and a great one is knowing which piece of paper to look for. They'll sell you a whole new engine when all you need is a gasket. They'll sell you a new transmission when all you need is this." He had tapped the small, grainy photograph of the bushing with a grease-stained finger. They count on you not knowing. They make their money from the gaps in your knowledge. Your job is to have no gaps. That lesson had been branded into Wyatt's soul, but it was the event that followed a few years later that gave it its crushing weight. His grandfather's heart, the one whose rhythm he knew so well, gave out one spring morning while he was walking the fields. The loss was a cataclysm for the Carver family. He had been their anchor, their expert, the quiet force that held their small farm together. Without his encyclopedic knowledge of the machinery, things began to break down and stay broken. A crucial bearing on the planter failed during seeding, and the dealership repair took a week and cost a fortune. The combine's engine threw a rod mid-harvest, and without the old man there to work his magic, they had to hire a custom harvesting crew, wiping out what little profit they had hoped to make. The farm, which had always been a source of pride, became a source of debt. The bank, which had once been a friendly partner, became a source of anxious, official-looking letters. Wyatt, then just 19, had to drop his plans for college and step into a role he felt utterly unprepared for. He had his grandfather's hands and his grandfather's binders, but he didn't have his grandfather's confidence. The weight of that legacy, of the farm's survival, settled on his young shoulders, a quiet, constant pressure. It was this pressure that had driven him to that first local farm auction, not looking for a miracle, but for a chance, any chance, to turn his inheritance of knowledge into something tangible. The auction was held in a muddy field behind the volunteer fire department, a typical affair for the rural county. Farmers in seed caps and muddy boots gathered around rows of aging, sun-bleached equipment, their faces etched with the cautious skepticism of men who live by the whims of weather and markets. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a booming voice, stood on the back of a flatbed truck, his rhythmic patter echoing across the field. Most of the equipment was unremarkable: old plows, a rusty grain auger, a hay rake with several missing teeth. Wyatt moved through the rows, his hands in his pockets, his eyes scanning, listening. He wasn't looking at the machines themselves so much as he was looking for a specific kind of story, a specific kind of neglect. Then he saw it. It was an old New Holland haybine, a machine used for cutting and conditioning hay. It was a model from the early 80s, a good design but notoriously finicky. It sat by itself at the end of a row, looking forlorn. A handwritten sign on it read, "Gearbox locked, sold as is for parts." A few older farmers had already looked it over, shaken their heads, and walked away. A locked gearbox on a haybine usually meant a catastrophic failure of the main cutter bar drive, a repair that required specialized tools and expensive, hard-to-find parts. It was, for all intents and purposes, a 2-ton paperweight. Wyatt walked up to it. He didn't try to turn the PTO shaft, which he knew would be solid. Instead, he knelt and looked underneath at the main drive assembly. He didn't touch anything. He just looked. He saw the grease fittings, some of which were caked with old, dry grease, while others were clean, indicating a recent, failed attempt at maintenance. Then his eyes settled on the wobble box, the component that converted the rotary motion of the PTO into the oscillating motion of the cutter bar. He saw a small, almost imperceptible detail that everyone else had missed. A single bolt on the housing was shiny, whereas all the others around it were covered in a uniform layer of grime and faded paint. He stood up and walked back to his truck. He opened his grandfather's binder for New Holland equipment. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning his grandfather's spidery handwriting. He found the section on the 488 model. There, next to a diagram of the wobble box assembly, his grandfather had written a note. Rule number 23. If gearbox locks after a loud bang, check the idler pulley tensioner bolt first. Fools will think it's the gearbox. The bolt can shear, dropping the pulley and jamming the whole drive. Sounds like hell, but it's a 10-minute fix. They put the bolt in from the bottom. Stupid design. Wyatt closed the binder. He knew. He walked back to the machine just as the auctioneer was starting the bidding. All right, folks, what am I bid for this fine piece of scrap iron? Good for a boat anchor, or maybe you need to hold down a tarp in a hurricane. Let's start it at $100. Who'll give me $100? Silence. $50? Do I hear 50? It's got to be worth that in scrap. Wyatt raised a single finger. I got 50 from the young man in the overalls. Do I hear 60? 50 once, 50 twice? The auctioneer looked around, hoping for another bid, but the other farmers were already looking at the next item. Sold for $50 to the boy who likes a challenge. A few men chuckled. One old farmer patted him on the back as he walked by. Good luck with that, son. You're going to need it. Wyatt paid the clerk his $50, hooked the haybine up to the back of his old Ford, and towed it home. He didn't pull it into the main workshop. He left it in the yard. He went to his grandfather's bolt collection, a massive set of organized bins that covered an entire wall. He found the correct grade 8 bolt and a new lock washer. He slid under the haybine, unscrewed the sheared stub of the old bolt, raised the idler pulley back into position with a small pry bar, and threaded the new bolt in. He tightened it, put a shot of grease into the fitting for good measure, and stood up. The whole operation took less than 15 minutes. He walked to the front of the machine, grabbed the PTO shaft with both hands, and gave it a turn. It spun freely, with the smooth, satisfying click of the cutter bar drive engaging perfectly. The next morning, an old farmer named George Richter, a man who had been one of his grandfather's closest friends, drove into the yard. He had been at the auction. He saw the haybine sitting there, no longer hooked to Wyatt's truck. "Came to see your boat anchor," George said, a wry smile on his weathered face. Wyatt just nodded toward the machine. "Go ahead, give it a spin." George walked over, his expression skeptical. He was a big man, with hands like leather platters. He grabbed the PTO shaft and gave it a tentative turn. His eyebrows shot up. He spun it again, faster this time, listening to the healthy mechanical music coming from the drive. He stood there for a long moment, looking from the machine to Wyatt and back again. He walked over to Wyatt, who was wiping his hands on a rag. George stuck out his hand. "Your granddad would be proud," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that went beyond the simple repair of an old machine. "He always said you had the gift, the ability to see." The handshake was firm, a transfer of respect from one generation to another. It was a small victory, a $50 gamble that had paid off not in money, but in something far more valuable. It was a confirmation that the knowledge in the binders, the philosophy of his grandfather, was real, and it was powerful. But that small victory, like a ripple in a quiet pond, did not go unnoticed. George Richter told a few friends. Those friends told others. The story of the $50 haybine spread through the old-timers network. A minor legend passed over coffee at the grain co-op. And eventually, the story reached the clean, air-conditioned office of Sterling Black, who did not see it as a charming tale of rural ingenuity. He saw it as an anomaly in his market analysis, a small, stubborn weed growing in the perfectly manicured lawn of his business plan. And he decided it was time to either pluck it or pave over it. A few days later, a gleaming white pickup truck with the Agri-Future logo emblazoned on its doors rolled down the long gravel driveway of the Carver farm. It crunched to a halt in the yard, and Sterling Black stepped out, his polished boots sinking slightly into the dusty ground. He looked around at the peeling paint of the farmhouse, the sagging roof of the barn, and the collection of old, half-repaired implements that dotted the yard like steel scarecrows. His expression was a mixture of distaste and pity. Wyatt was in the workshop grinding a valve seat. He heard the truck arrive and felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He shut off the grinder, wiped his hands on the ever-present rag, and stepped out into the bright sunlight, blinking as his eyes adjusted. "Wyatt Carver?" Sterling asked, though he already knew the answer. He extended a hand, the smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Sterling Black, from Agri-Future. I've been hearing your name around town." Wyatt shook his hand. Sterling's grip was firm but soft, the hand of a man who signed checks, not fixed engines. "What can I do for you, Mr. Black?" Wyatt asked, his tone neutral. "Please call me Sterling," he said, his gaze sweeping over the scene of organized decay again. "Listen, son, I'll get right to the point. I heard about what you did with that old haybine. Smart move. Very clever." He paused as if weighing his next words carefully. "You've got some raw talent, kid. A good mechanical mind, but you're wasting it here." He gestured vaguely at the farm. This is the past. The future is with us. At Agri-Future." Wyatt remained silent, waiting. I want to offer you a job," Sterling said, delivering the line as if he were bestowing a great honor. "As a junior technician in our service department, we'll give you factory training, a real uniform, a steady paycheck, benefits. We'll take that raw talent of yours and we'll polish it, give you a real career, stop you from playing around in the mud out here." The offer hung in the air between them. It was, on its surface, a lifeline. It was a way out of the debt, a path to stability. For a fleeting moment, Wyatt considered it. He thought of the stack of bills on the kitchen table, of his mother's worried face. But then he looked at Sterling's clean boots, at his condescending smile, and he looked back at the open doors of his grandfather's workshop, the place where he had learned that work was about more than a paycheck. It was about honesty, about integrity, about a sacred trust between a man, his machine, and his neighbor. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Black," Wyatt said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I'm fine where I am." Sterling's smile faltered. He seemed genuinely baffled, as if Wyatt had just spoken in a foreign language. He had come expecting gratitude, perhaps even a tearful acceptance. Rejection was not a variable in his calculations. "Fine where you are?" he repeated, a note of incredulity in his voice. "Son, look around you. This place is falling apart. I'm offering you a way out, a chance to be part of something successful." "I appreciate it," Wyatt said again, "but my answer is no." The mask of magnanimity dropped completely from Sterling's face. His eyes hardened. He saw Wyatt's refusal not as a choice based on principle, but as an act of defiance and insult. He mistook Wyatt's quiet dignity for foolish pride. "Suit yourself," he said, his voice turning cold and sharp. "Some people just prefer the scrapyard." He turned without another word, got back into his gleaming truck, and spun the tires in the gravel as he sped away, leaving a cloud of dust to settle over the quiet farm. The echo of his parting shot, the same line he had used to mock the old tractor, hung in the air. The battle line had been drawn. It was no longer about a single machine or a single repair. It was a war of two worlds, and Sterling Black had just made it personal. In the months that followed, Wyatt's life settled into a new rhythm. He was no longer just the Carver boy trying to keep the family farm afloat. He was becoming a quiet local institution. The story of the Haybine, followed by his refusal of Sterling's job offer, had solidified his reputation among the older generation of farmers. They were a demographic that Sterling Black, with all his market research and demographic analysis, had fundamentally misunderstood. These were men who had built their farms on handshakes, who valued a man's word over a written contract, and who believed that integrity was a currency more stable than the dollar. They saw in Wyatt a reflection of his grandfather, a continuation of a code they thought was vanishing. Calls started coming in. At first it was small things, a tractor that wouldn't start, a hydraulic line that kept blowing, a combine that was running rough. Wyatt never advertised. He didn't have to. His customers were his marketing department. A farmer would be complaining at the co-op about the outrageous quote he got from AgriFuture, and another would lean in and say, "You should take it out to the Carver boy. He'll treat you right." Wyatt's workshop became a haven for machines the dealership had condemned. He worked with a quiet, methodical intensity. For every machine that came in, the first step was always the same. He would pull the relevant binder from the shelf, open it on the clean section of his workbench, and read. He would read the manufacturer's specifications, and then he would read his grandfather's handwritten notes. He was not just fixing a machine. He was in a conversation with the past, consulting with the ghost that haunted the workshop. He charged fair prices, often just for parts and a modest amount for his time. More than once, for a neighbor he knew was struggling, he'd leave the labor line on the invoice blank, simply writing "paid," with a nod to some long-forgotten kindness the neighbor had shown his family years ago. He was building a business not on profit margins, but on a foundation of communal trust. Sterling Black, meanwhile, escalated his campaign. The AgriFuture dealership began running aggressive radio ads and full-page spreads in the local paper. The ads were slick and professional, featuring smiling families standing in front of shiny new tractors. The subtext was always the same. Progress was inevitable, and clinging to the old ways was a recipe for failure. One series of ads subtly targeted Wyatt without ever mentioning his name. They warned of the dangers of uncertified backyard mechanics, speaking of voided warranties and the risks of using non-genuine parts. They positioned AgriFuture not just as a seller of equipment, but as the sole arbiter of its maintenance and repair, a closed system from which there was no escape. Sterling's most insidious move, however, was invisible to the public. He had his finance department do a quiet credit check on the Carver farm. He discovered that the mortgage note, which had been refinanced after his grandfather's death, was held by the small local bank. Sterling approached the bank president, a man he played golf with, and made an offer to buy the note. His plan was simple: Become Wyatt's creditor, and then, at the first sign of a late payment, use that leverage to either force him to sell the farm or accept the job he had so foolishly refused. The bank president, a man who valued his relationship with the powerful dealership more than his loyalty to a struggling local family, agreed to the deal. The official letter that arrived at the Carver farm, informing them that their loan was now owned by a subsidiary holding company of Agri-Future, felt like a declaration of war. Wyatt's mother was terrified, but Wyatt just folded the letter, tucked it into the John Deere binder, and went back to work, his jaw set in a hard, determined line. The pressure had intensified, but so had his resolve. The crucible came during the peak of the fall harvest. A farmer named Miller, one of Wyatt's first and most loyal customers, brought in his combine with a serious problem. The threshing cylinder was running at an inconsistent speed, causing him to lose a significant amount of grain out the back. It was a complex problem that could have a dozen different causes. Wyatt, under immense pressure to get Miller back in the field, rushed the diagnosis. He was sure it was a faulty hydraulic motor that powered the cylinder. It was the most common cause, the obvious answer. He bypassed his grandfather's most important rule. He didn't go all the way to the bottom of the problem. He ordered a new hydraulic motor, an expensive part, and worked through the night to install it. He delivered the combine back to Miller the next morning, confident he had solved the issue. 2 hours later, Miller called, his voice frantic. The problem was back, and it was worse. The combine was now completely unusable. A cold wave of shame and failure washed over Wyatt. He had not only failed to fix the machine, but he had cost his customer a precious day of harvest and sold him a part he didn't need. He drove out to Miller's field immediately. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to deflect blame. He stood before the farmer, covered in dust and disappointment, and took full responsibility. "I messed up, Frank," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was wrong. I'm sorry." He towed the combine back to his shop. He refunded Miller the full cost of the repair, including the price of the new motor he had installed. Then he did what he should have done in the first place. He pulled the binder. He sat down and read for an hour. He started from the beginning, tracing the entire hydraulic and electronic system that controlled the cylinder speed. He found a small, obscure note from his grandfather about a similar problem on a different model. "Check the sensor wiring harness where it passes through the firewall. It can rub and short intermittently. Looks fine, but the signal goes crazy under load. A 5-cent piece of electrical tape can save you $5,000. Wyatt went back to the combine with a flashlight and a multimeter. He found the harness. He peeled back the protective sheathing. There it was, a tiny spot where the insulation on a single wire had been rubbed bare, causing it to short against the metal frame whenever the machine vibrated at a certain frequency. It was a problem that would never show up in a static shop test. It only revealed itself under the strain of real work. He repaired the wire, carefully wrapping it and securing the harness away from the sharp edge. To make up for the lost time, he knew he had to get Miller a replacement machine. He sold a set of his grandfather's prized antique wrenches, the only thing of personal value he had left, to a collector, and used the money to rent a combine for Miller for 2 days. He worked another 36 hours straight, completely rebuilding the section of Miller's machine he had misdiagnosed, replacing not just the wire, but every bearing and seal in the vicinity, just to be certain. When he finally returned the combine, it ran better than it had in years. The mistake had cost him dearly, both in money and in confidence, but in the long run, it became another cornerstone of his legend. Frank Miller told everyone what had happened. He didn't talk about the mistake. He talked about what happened after. He talked about the immediate apology, the full refund, the integrity of a man who made himself poorer to make things right. In a world of service departments that argued over warranty clauses and deflected blame, Wyatt's radical honesty was a revelation. His business, which had dipped for a few weeks as word of the initial failure got out, came back stronger than ever. And Wyatt, humbled and hardened by the experience, added a new rule to his grandfather's binder, writing it in his own neat hand on a fresh piece of paper. Rule number 74, it read. Check the diagnosis twice. Check the part once, then check the diagnosis again. The machine is never lying. You are just not listening carefully enough. It was this renewed, almost fanatical, commitment to meticulous diagnosis that was on his mind when Abe Henderson's son showed up at the shop a month later, his face pale with worry. Abe was one of the most respected farmers in the county, a man in his late 60s who had recently invested his life savings into a nearly new John Deere tractor from AgriFuture. It was his retirement tractor, the one that was supposed to see him through his final years of farming with comfort and reliability. But now, with less than 200 hours on the meter, it was dead. "It's the transmission, Wyatt," Abe's son said, his voice strained. "We were plowing, shifted into reverse to turn around, and there was a loud bang, like a gunshot, and that was it. It's locked up solid, won't move an inch." Wyatt felt a strange sense of déjà vu. "What did the dealership say?" he asked. "They towed it in. Had it for a week. Sterling Black called Dad this morning." He paused and swallowed hard. "They said the whole transmission is shot. Internals are shattered. They said it was probably operator error, so it's not covered under warranty. They quoted him $11,400 to replace it." $11,400. The number was obscene. It was a death sentence for a farmer like Abe, who was already leveraged to the hilt. "They said the only other option," Abe's son continued, his voice cracking, "was to trade it in on a new model. They offered him pennies on the dollar for it, of course." Wyatt looked past the boy, his gaze becoming distant. A loud bang after shifting into reverse, a transmission locked up solid. The ghost of a 50-year-old service bulletin flickered in his mind. The modern transmissions were more complex, computer-controlled, a different beast entirely. But the principles of mechanics, the physics of gears and shafts, were eternal. "Tell your dad not to agree to anything," Wyatt said, his voice low and steady. "Tell him I'll come get it." The trap was not yet set, but the bait had just been laid. Wyatt towed the massive inert green tractor back to his shop. It was a beautiful machine, barely used, the digital dashboard dark and lifeless. He didn't even try to start it. He went straight to the shelf and pulled down a binder. It wasn't one of his grandfather's. It was a new one he had started himself, labeled Modern Systems. For the past year, he had been spending his nights on the internet, downloading technical manuals, reading mechanic forums, and compiling his own TSBs for the new generation of equipment. He was applying his grandfather's methodology to a new era. He found the section for the Power Quad transmission, the model in Abe's tractor. He read for hours, cross-referencing diagrams, tracing the evolution of the design from the old synchro range his grandfather knew so well. He discovered that, despite the addition of electronic controls and hydraulic clutch packs, the core mechanical layout for the reverse gear was remarkably similar to the old design. It still used a reverse idler gear on a simple shaft. The engineers had changed 1,000 things, but they had kept that one, simple, ancient piece of geometry. A suspicion, cold and sharp, formed in his mind. It was a wild, improbable leap of logic. But his grandfather had taught him that the most improbable solutions are often the ones everyone else has overlooked. He went online, not to the official John Deere parts catalog, but to a small, obscure website run by a man in Iowa who specialized in vintage tractor parts. He navigated to the section for the 4020 synchro range transmission. He found the part number from the 1958 service bulletin, the improved, hardened steel reverse idler shaft bushing. It was still in stock. The price was $14. He ordered it. He paid for overnight shipping. He didn't tell Abe or his son what he was doing. He just told them he was looking into it. While he waited for the part to arrive, he did nothing to the tractor. He simply covered it with a tarp. To anyone looking in, it would appear that the problem was too big for him, that the machine was sitting, defeated, in his yard. He knew Sterling Black would have his spies, other customers, or salesmen who would drive by and report back. He wanted Sterling to think he was winning. He wanted him to grow more confident, more arrogant. He was letting the antagonist walk deeper and deeper into a trap that, for now, existed only in his mind and in a small cardboard box making its way across the country. And so the stage was set for Sterling Black's Farmer Appreciation Day. It was the culmination of his strategy, a grand gesture designed to cement his dealership's place as the undisputed king of the county's agricultural economy. He had spared no expense. The food was plentiful, the beer was cold, and the promises of low-interest financing flowed as freely as the complimentary coffee. He had even, in a stroke of what he considered brilliant showmanship, arranged to have Abe Henderson's broken-down tractor trailered into the main showroom. It sat there under the lights, a silent, powerful testament to the folly of trying to survive without the dealership's expert and expensive protection. It was the centerpiece of his sermon. When Wyatt Carver walked through the doors, Sterling felt a surge of triumph. The boy's arrival was an unplanned gift, a perfect, dramatic opportunity to crush the last ember of resistance in the community. He watched Wyatt move through the room, saw the condescending smirks from his salesman, and felt the power dynamic in the room shift entirely in his favor. He waited until the crowd was thick around the stage, until every important farmer in the county was present and listening. Then he launched his attack. He began his speech with the usual platitudes, but his eyes kept flicking toward Wyatt. Then he turned his attention to the crippled tractor beside him. "We're here to talk about the future," he said, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "But sometimes, the best way to understand the future is to look at a failure from the past." He gestured to the tractor. "This machine belongs to a good man, Abe Henderson, a man we all respect. And it broke down, a serious internal transmission failure." He paused, letting the gravity of the statement sink in. "Now, some folks," he said, his gaze finally locking directly onto Wyatt, "think you can fix these new, complex machines with old tricks and a rusty wrench. They'll tell you they can save you $1. They whisper in your ear about some magic fix." The crowd was silent, all eyes moving from Sterling to Wyatt and back again. The humiliation was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket. "But what they don't tell you," Sterling continued, his voice rising, "is the cost of that kind of thinking, the cost of failure. We did a full diagnostic on this machine, our factory-trained technicians, using the latest equipment. The repair requires a full transmission replacement. We quoted Mr. Henderson $11,400, a fair price for a complex job that ensures his machine will run like new." He let the number hang in the air, a monument to his dealership's authority. "But maybe," he said, a cruel, knowing smirk spreading across his face, "our local expert here has a better idea. Maybe he can fix it with a piece of baling wire and a prayer." The trap was sprung. But it was not Wyatt who was in it. Sterling, high on his own arrogance, decided to press his advantage. He saw Wyatt's silence not as restraint, but as defeat. "Don't be shy, son," he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Tell us all how you'd fix it, or maybe you think it just belongs in the scrapyard." He had repeated the line, the final, fatal mistake. Wyatt didn't answer him. He didn't even look at him. He began to walk forward, his old work boots making a soft, steady sound on the polished concrete floor. The crowd parted for him as if by instinct. He stopped not at the stage, but next to Abe Henderson, who was standing in the front row, his face a mask of despair. Wyatt reached into the pocket of his overalls and pulled out a small, clear plastic bag. Inside, a single small piece of metal gleamed under the showroom lights. It was the bronze bushing delivered that morning. He held it up for Abe to see, then closed his hand around it. He turned his attention back to the crowd, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the farmers, men he had known his whole life. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not amplified by a microphone, but it carried with a quiet authority that cut through the tension in the room. "Before I say anything," he began, his voice calm and even, "I'd like to ask a question. Is Mr. Dave Albright here? From the State Equipment Board?" A murmur went through the crowd. Dave Albright was a legend, the head mechanic for the state's fleet of road and agricultural equipment for over 30 years. He was a neutral, unimpeachable authority, a man whose knowledge was respected by everyone. In the back of the room, a tall, weathered man in a simple jacket raised his hand. "I'm here, Wyatt," he said. Sterling Black's smirk flickered for the first time. The introduction of an outside expert was not part of his script. "Mr. Albright," Wyatt said, his voice respectful, "could you tell these folks what happens when the reverse idler shaft bushing fails on a modern power quad transmission, one based on the old synchro range design?" Albright, the neutral authority, looked surprised by the specificity of the question. He rubbed his chin. his mind clearly working through decades of mechanical knowledge. The entire room hung on his answer. "Well," he said slowly, his voice raspy but clear. "That's an old problem. I haven't seen that in years. The bushing wears, the shaft gets some play in it, and when you shift into reverse under load, the whole gear train can bind up, locks the transmission solid, sounds and feels like the whole thing has grenaded itself. Makes you think the whole transmission is shot." He paused, then added the crucial sentence, "But it's just a cheap bushing, a known issue on some of the older models. I thought they'd engineered that flaw out by now." One sentence. That was all it took. A silence, profound and absolute, fell over the showroom. It was not an empty silence. It was filled with the furious, silent turning of gears in the minds of every farmer in the room. They were not mechanics like Wyatt or Albright, but they were men who lived with machinery. They understood the concept of a small part causing a catastrophic failure. They understood the difference between a simple, known flaw and a complete, system-wide destruction. They looked from the tiny, insignificant-looking bag in Wyatt's hand to the massive multi-ton tractor on the stage, and then, as one, their eyes settled on Sterling Black. The blood had drained from Sterling's face. The practiced smile was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of disbelief. In that moment of pure, unadulterated silence, he was no longer the master of ceremonies. He was the exhibit. The farmers' faces, which had been a mixture of curiosity and pity for Wyatt, were now hard, cold masks of betrayal. They were looking at Sterling and not seeing a savvy businessman, but a con artist. They were replaying every conversation, every service invoice, every repair quote from AgriFuture in their minds, and reevaluating them in the harsh, unforgiving light of this new revelation. The silence was the sound of trust evaporating. It was the sound of a reputation turning to dust. Wyatt let the silence do its work. He let it stretch until it was uncomfortable, until it was unbearable. Then he walked up to the stage. He didn't climb it. He simply reached out and placed the small plastic bag with the $14 bushing on the polished green hood of Abe Henderson's tractor. It sat there, a tiny David against a metal Goliath. He finally turned his gaze to Sterling Black, who seemed to have shrunk, diminished by the weight of the room's collective judgment. Wyatt's voice, when he spoke, was not angry. It was quiet, matter-of-fact, and utterly devastating. "It was never about the scrapyard," he said, his words a clear, perfect echo of Sterling's own insult. "It was about knowing what doesn't belong there." He then turned to Abe Henderson, whose face was a storm of conflicting emotions, shock, relief, and a dawning righteous anger. "Abe," Wyatt said, his voice gentle now, "your tractor will be ready tomorrow. No charge." That was the final blow. It wasn't just about the lie. It was about the grace of the man who had exposed it. Without a word, one of the oldest farmers in the room, a man named Henderson, could barely afford to lose a day's work, let alone $11,000, turned and walked toward the exit. Then another followed, and another. It was not a stampede, but a slow, deliberate exodus. They walked past the gleaming new combines, past the smiling salesmen who now looked like fools, past the table of untouched barbecue. They were voting with their feet. Within 2 minutes, the showroom was nearly empty. All that remained was Wyatt, Abe Henderson, who was now weeping silently, a few stunned AgriFuture employees, and Sterling Black, standing alone on his stage, a king in a suddenly empty kingdom, staring at a $14 part that had just destroyed his world. The fallout was swift and brutal. The story of the $14 bushing and the $11,000 quote did not just spread through the county, it became a regional legend, a piece of modern folklore. It was a story told in diners, in feed stores, and at auction houses, a cautionary tale about corporate arrogance and rural wisdom. AgriFuture's business did not just decline, it collapsed. Farmers who had signed service contracts found lawyers to scrutinize the fine print. Those who had been considering a new purchase took their business to smaller, family-owned dealerships 100 miles away. The brand, once a symbol of progress, became a mark of shame. The corporate headquarters of the parent company, alerted by the sudden and catastrophic drop in revenue and a flood of angry letters, launched an internal investigation. What they found was not a single isolated incident of overquoting, but a systemic pattern of predatory service practices orchestrated by Sterling Black. He had been incentivizing his service managers to condemn viable parts and push for full component replacements, boosting his department's profits and his own bonuses. The fraud was so blatant, so widespread, that the corporation had no choice. Sterling Black was fired, not with a severance package, but with the threat of legal action. The dealership itself, its reputation irrevocably shattered, was closed down within 6 months. The karma was proportional to the insult, but its financial and social consequences were far greater. The shiny building that had been a temple to a false future sat empty, a monument to greed. A few weeks after the dealership closed, Wyatt heard that Sterling was back in town, clearing out his office under the supervision of a corporate liquidator. The news brought Wyatt no joy. He felt a strange, hollow ache where he thought victory would be. He drove into town, not knowing what he would say or do. He parked his old truck in the now empty lot and walked toward the building. Through the glass doors, he could see Sterling inside, packing personal effects into a cardboard box. But it was not Sterling who caught his eye. It was a young man, barely out of his teens, who had been one of Sterling's junior service technicians. The boy was sitting on a curb, his head in his hands, his uniform stripped of its corporate logos. He was out of a job, a casualty of a war he hadn't started. Wyatt walked over to the young man. "You're Sam, right?" he asked quietly. The boy looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. He recognized Wyatt and seemed to brace for a gloating remark. "Yeah," he mumbled. "You know your way around a diagnostic scanner pretty well," Wyatt said. It was a simple statement of fact. He'd seen the boy work at a distance once. "You're good with the electronic side of things." Sam just shrugged, a gesture of complete defeat. "Doesn't matter now." "It might," Wyatt said. "I'm expanding. I bought some of the diagnostic gear at the liquidation auction. I could use a hand, especially someone who understands the new computer systems better than I do. The work is honest. The pay isn't what you were making here, but it's fair." He paused, letting the offer settle. "Good hands shouldn't go to waste." The young man stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. He had expected anger, or at least indifference. He had not expected grace. He had not expected a job offer from the very man his boss had tried to ruin. In that moment of quiet compassion, Wyatt's victory was complete. It was not just about being right, it was about being good. It was a final unspoken lesson from his grandfather. You prove your strength not by how you treat your enemies, but by how you treat the innocent, caught in the crossfire. Wyatt's business, Carver Repair, flourished. He eventually bought the foreclosed Agri-Future building for a fair price at a bank auction. He had the massive, arrogant logo scraped off the front and replaced it with a simple hand-painted sign, Carver and Sons Repair. The Sons was in honor of the generation that was yet to come, a nod to the future his grandfather had believed in. The shop became the heart of the county's agricultural community, a place built not on slick marketing, but on the bedrock of trust he had painstakingly laid. He finally paid off the farm's mortgage, the one Sterling had bought to destroy him, and on the day he sent the final payment, he burned the notice from the bank in an old oil drum, watching the smoke curl up into the clear blue sky. Years passed. The dust of the conflict settled and became part of the land. Wyatt Carver was no longer the Carver boy. He was Mr. Carver, a respected pillar of his community. His hands were still scarred, but now they were the hands of a master, a man who, like his grandfather before him, could diagnose an engine's ailment by the sound of its soul. The binders on his shelf had multiplied, some filled with his own neat handwriting, his own hard-won rules. One crisp autumn afternoon, a rusty, beat-up pickup truck that reminded Wyatt of his own long-gone Ford sputtered into his yard. A young man, lanky and nervous, with a familiar fire of earnest intensity in his eyes, climbed out. He couldn't have been more than 18. He was clutching a worn, grease-stained notebook. "Mr. Carver?" the young man asked, his voice hesitant. "That's me," Wyatt said, wiping his hands on a rag. "My name is Ben. I have a question. About a hydraulic valve on an old 1070 case. The schematics say one thing, but the way it's acting says another. I've been trying to figure it out for a week." He opened his notebook to show Wyatt a page of detailed hand-drawn diagrams and notes. He had already done the work. He had already gone looking for the truth. Wyatt looked at the boy, at his grease-stained hands, at his hungry, intelligent eyes, at the notebook filled with questions. And in that moment, he saw himself. He saw the past, the present, and the future all at once. The circle was completing. A smile, genuine and warm, spread across his face. He gestured toward the open bay of the shop. "Come on in," he said. He walked over to the long shelf and pulled down the binder labeled Case Agri-King. He laid it open on the clean space of the workbench, its pages a testament to the accumulated wisdom of generations. He pointed to a diagram, then to one of his grandfather's handwritten notes beside it. "All right, Ben," Wyatt said, his voice the same quiet, patient rumble his grandfather's had been all those years ago. "Let's start from the beginning. The first rule is, you have to listen." He began to explain, his finger tracing the lines on the page, passing the knowledge from his hands to a new pair. Because he understood, in a way Sterling Black never could, that you don't build a legacy out of steel and rubber and profit margins. You build it out of knowledge and integrity. You build it by keeping your promises. You build it one repair, one handshake, one lesson at a time. In the end, the land doesn't remember the salesman, it remembers the mechanics.